right. Welcome everyone. Welcome to day 2. I'm really excited to welcome you all back to the second day of our virtual conference. So I want to start again by acknowledging the land that we're meeting on. That while we're all joining from different places, where I'm located is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse nations and Inuit and Métis people. I also acknowledge that the area is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Treaties are constitutionally recognized agreements and meant to represent respectful partnerships between Indigenous people and the Crown. However, treaties have often been betrayed and colonial practices have and continue to ignore or discredit the rights of Indigenous people, often citing different interpretations of those agreements. These betrayals have led to ignorance and misunderstanding on the part of non-Indigenous people, and they have and continue to lead to harm and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, as well as our relationships with each other. We're all treaty people, and we all need to consider what that means for us and our communities. As a group interested and invested in issues pertaining to rural Canada, this acknowledgement is important for many reasons. First, we must recognize the past and current injustices that our presence on these lands has contributed to. In the last year alone, events such as those in Wet'suwet'en, as well as the Sabanagadi First Nation, highlight the need for ongoing reflection and recognition of the implications of colonization in so many communities, and that we have so far to come. These events highlight the need for us not only to learn individually, but to work towards being better allies by, at the very least, educating and engaging with our peers and neighbors about these histories and injustices. This work is ours to do. Second, we must also recognize the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on these lands and in our communities. They are our neighbors, and as the original stewards of the land that now make up what we know as Canada, we have so much to learn from traditional knowledge about this place. As non-metro places grapple with increasing environmental and economic pressures, Indigenous knowledges and forms of activism are paramount to surmount these challenges. We must also celebrate the contributions that individuals, communities, and organizations have made and continue to make to our communities. For example, in Saskatchewan, the First Nations Power Authority is a nonprofit dedicated to creating Indigenous, curated, owned, and developed renewable power generation in the province. Through a partnership model, they seek to create long-term sustainable value for their members through investment, employment, infrastructure, and new business opportunities. As I represent an organization made up of members from many disciplines, I recognize that this is a small act, but I hope that it encourages everyone joining us today to take some time to recognize and reflect on the processes of colonization and the ways in which our individual disciplines have been active and complicit in these violent histories. As a board, we have been actively engaged in these discussions about how our organization can adjust our own practices and embed these discussions in the core activities that we do. I hope that each of you also take some time to reflect on this and what it means for you in your own community or in your professional practice. While I certainly can't recognize all the territories that we joined from today, I encourage everyone here to also do some research to learn about the land you're working from, joining from, or familiar with. While local and regional resources will be more instructive in this, I'm going to share a few web pages in the chat that may serve as a starting point for you in your own learning on this process. But at this point, I'm going to flip it over to Sara, who is the SURF president, who's going to introduce our next words of welcome.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Kyle, for all your hard work. And yes, this has been great. We're still making that surf magic even online. So happy to see that. So today, I'd like to welcome a special guest to give a greeting. So over the years, SURF has had a highly collaborative relationship with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or FCM for short, and particularly with their Rural Forum. Over the pandemic, FCM staff and the Rural Forum have been allies in our quest to share knowledge and resources related to the rural story. And FCM has been advocating for rural Canada in their own ways. Here today to give a brief greeting and update from the FCM Rural Forum is Ray Orb, an amazing rural leader who wears many rural hats. Ray Orb is the chair of the FCM Rural Forum, president of the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, the Reeve of the Rural Municipality of Cupar, and is a retired farmer. Ray, I welcome you to the virtual stage.
Well, thanks very much, Sara, for that kind invitation. And good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for having me today. So I have to say that the wealth of knowledge coming out of this conference is so valuable to rural municipal leaders like myself. And it's no surprise, considering the great work that the CRRF does every single day. Your conference theme, supporting rural recovery and resilience, and this topic, of course, is on my mind a lot these days because Rural Forum has been deeply involved in bringing a rural perspective to Canada's COVID-19 response and to our recovery. For those of you who don't know, FCM is a federation of Canadian municipalities, and we are the national voice for local governments, representing more than 2,000 municipalities of all sizes. And our Rural Forum brings together rural leaders from across the country to help shape FCM's federal advocacy. And I'm proud to serve as the FCM chair of the Rural Forum. And together we've made major gains for rural Canada, including federal investments in rural infrastructure, high-speed broadband, and more. COVID-19 has certainly brought on new urgency to our work because, like all municipalities, rural communities have been on the front line of this pandemic. We've worked flat out to protect people and businesses and to keep vital services going strong. And FCM's Rural Forum has been there to help every step of the way, from bringing rural leaders together to coordinating frontline efforts, to helping shape Canada's pandemic response, and so it meets the needs of rural communities. As we head into the fall, our top priority remains protecting our communities from a second wave of COVID-19 while gearing up to lead Canada's recovery, because there can be no recovery without strong and vibrant rural communities. The fact is, recovering from this pandemic will require a bold and creative plan driven by the governments closest to daily life. Just like Canada's pandemic response, our nationwide recovery must be rooted in communities across the country. There are places where Canadians live, work, and raise their families. These are the rural places. These are the places where local leaders are responding to people's challenges in real time. What's before us now is an opportunity for all governments to work together to bring this country back stronger than ever. It's an opportunity to build a more prosperous, resilient, and connected Canada, and one that's inclusive for everyone. And rural communities need to be at the heart of it. After all, we're home to about 10 million people and drive nearly 30% of Canada's GDP. Rural hard work and ingenuity already are taking on this country's biggest challenges. We're also urging the federal government to work with local leaders to expand economic opportunity for all rural Canadians, from supporting rural economic development agencies so we can diversify local economies, to strengthening rural infrastructure to drive growth and a better quality of life, to investing in local climate adaptation projects that build more resilient communities across the country. Of course, as an absolute starting point for supporting rural communities, Canada needs to finally close its digital divide. COVID-19 has exposed just how glaring this divide is. When lockdowns last spring forced millions of Canadians online for work, school, and basic human connection, many rural residents were simply left behind. That's because 2 million Canadians still can't access a reliable, fixed, or a mobile connection. And that's unacceptable at the best of times. Well, during a global pandemic, of course, that's a huge disadvantage. And FCM and its Rural Forum have worked closely with the federal government to make important progress over the past few years. And Budget 219 included significant commitments to universal broadband. And last week's speech from the throne committed to close the rural broadband gap faster. That shows our advocacy is being heard. But the fact is, too many rural communities are still waiting for results on the ground, and that's frustrating. In this day and age, a reliable, high-speed connection is essential to our economy and to our quality of life, and it's key to unlocking rural Canada's potential. And it's how we ensure that every community is part of the recovery we all want to build. So FCM won't stop until all Canadians have broadband internet access, no matter where they live. Thank you again to the CRRF for having me today, and I'm thrilled to see this close collaboration with so many rural residents. And I want you to know that FCM will continue to be your partner in building better lives in Canada's rural communities. Look forward for the discussions that will unfold today and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray, for your greeting and for the hard work that FCM's Rural Forum is doing for rural Canada during this time. SURF looks forward to continuing to work collaboratively with the Rural Forum and yourself and your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce the amazing Sean Markey and Wayne Kelly, who will give us an update from our partners, the Rural Policy Learning Commons. Sean, Dr. Sean Markey, would you like to take it away? And do you have
Great, thank you, Sarah. I think Wayne's going to kick us off here.
So welcome everyone. As both a SURF board member and the RPLC project coordinator, I'm really happy to help kick off the second day of the SURF conference. I think I was saying to Ashley at the end of the day yesterday, well, we're not in person, and we'd all love to be there in person. It definitely feels like a SURF conference. There's lots of connecting and networking and a lot of learning. So with that in mind, I just wanted to sort of provide some background on RPLC. You've heard RPLC, Rural Policy Learning Commons, mentioned throughout yesterday, and you'll hear it a little bit more today. And I just want to sort of give a quick update on what we're doing, what we've been up to, and then Sean's going to sort of talk about where we're going. Quickly, the RPLC is a partnership network that's focused on rural policy and research. It's an international network. It's across Canada. It's in the US, Mexico, and across Europe as well. With that in mind, and I think Kyle sort of did a fantastic job with his land acknowledgements yesterday and today, and everybody has been doing a fantastic job, and it's a really important piece. I'm not able to acknowledge all of the Indigenous lands that we're on, but I did want to talk about the fact that RPLC is hosted at Brandon University. I live and work here in Brandon, Manitoba, so that's Western Manitoba. And I do a lot of my research, actually my own personal research and research through the university in Western Manitoba. And so both myself and RPLC, we're located on Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 lands, the traditional homelands of the Dakota, Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Métis people. And I just want to make sure that, again, RPLC works across Canada and international, and there's a lot of fantastic acknowledgements and that have been going on, and we need to recognize the importance of the lands that we're on. So with that being said, I just want to take 5 minutes to give you an update of where we've been with RPLC. RPLC is now in the 7th year of what was supposed to be a 7-year research project, or partnership project. There's been a bit of an extension due to COVID, so we are going to be working into an 8th year next year, sort of throughout most of 2021. But we have been a very active network over the past 6 years, since 2014. And again, SURF and RPLC have been in partnership right since the beginning of 2014. And SURF is one of our core partner networks that makes up the group of rural policy researchers, practitioners, and leaders in the rural RPLC network. So specifically, I'm looking at sort of what have we been up to since sort of April 2015, when we started in 2014. We really got off the ground running sort of start of April, or start of 2015, and then our activities really kicked in into high gear sort of towards the end of that first year. The RPLC is really focused on support and partnership. It's not a research project in and of its own right. So one of the main activities that we're doing is providing supports for students to learn, to get employed, to build experience in rural research and rural policy related activities. And we're really, another key objective is to really increase the exchange of that knowledge and expertise. So the Secretariat, a bit of the organizational structure for RPLC, there's a group of core people that support all of these activities, support the different networks, support the different partnerships. And that's the Secretariat. And that's my job, is to sort of lead the Secretariat. We're housed at a Brandon University, but it's really is just like the project, it's been an international effort. And over the last 6 years, we've actually had students, masters, PhD, and postdocs across 4 different countries working together collectively from a distance to support RPLC activities. So I'm just giving some highlights here. I think these presentations they're being recorded and they'll be available later. And there's some contact information at the end. If you have any questions about the specific activities that we've been up to, please feel free to contact myself or Sean or others in RPLC. One of the other key things that we do is we add to research knowledge. And again, we're not doing the research ourselves per se in terms of the RPLC teams, but we do support our RPLC members and our students and our partners to do research. One of the interesting stories and sort of a good showcase of that is another network that we work with is an International Comparative Rural Policy Studies network. There's a lot of overlap with SURF members, but this network is an international network, again, in Europe and the US and Mexico and Canada. And they'd had a book in the works to showcase all of the great research and learning that was coming out of this network. And the network's been around since 2004. So, you know, there's 16 years of expertise, and they'd had a book in the planning stages for about 10 years before before RPLC started. With some support from RPLC, we helped sort of get that book over the hump. And just late last year, that book has been published, and it's a book that includes 42 chapters and with over 75 authors, and it was published by Routledge, and it's a handbook on comparative rural policies studies. And so a really useful resource for policy researchers, students, and practitioners. And RPLC is really proud to sort of just help that book along. So that's another example of sort of some of the work that we're not leading, but we're supporting, and that's been a really key role for us. The other thing that we do is we strengthen, or another goal is what we try and strengthen networks and institutions. And as I started off by saying, RPLC has been involved with SURF since the beginning of RPLC in 2014. And that's included each of these SURF events, these fantastic events over the last 7 years. So 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and now virtually in 2020. It has been a fantastic experience for both RPLC and myself personally. I started attending in 2015. Summerside was my first experience, and that, I have to say, Lori and Ryan, it was a fantastic way to kick off my SURF exposure and indoctrination, if you will. But all of them have been fantastic, you know, right since the beginning. And these are fantastic events, and RPLC is really proud to be part of this. And it's been a huge part of us meeting our objectives in terms of the networks and the people and the learning that happens at these SURF events line up exactly with some of the outcomes and objectives that RPLC is working towards. I just wanted to sort of give a quick example of a couple other events, and then I'm going to hand it off to Sean. But we, in addition to SURF events, so national events, international events, we've also hosted or supported a local think tank here in Manitoba on economic development in rural back in 2014 when we started. And we've been involved in sort of major international events as well, supporting a shoulder event at the OECD Rural Development Conference in 2015 in Memphis. So we really do range between sort of the local activities all the way up to international. And again, the intent is not necessarily to be the host front and center, but to support the great work that's already happening amongst all these great rural networks. So that's just a quick update on where we've been and what we've been doing. And I'm just going to hand it over now to Sean to talk about where we're going.
Great, thanks, Wayne. And this is a really nice opportunity to thank you for all of your amazing work coordinating and really leading the RPLC network. I can't imagine where we would be without you. So huge congratulations to you for all of your work, and thank you for all of your work while you've been balancing your own doctoral studies. So it's been wonderful working with you, and I look forward to working together over the remaining year. So much like every other project and event and activity across the world, RPLC was forced to respond to COVID as well. Being a virtual network, I think across 9 time zones, Wayne, judging by how early I have to get up for some of our meetings on the West Coast, I think it's 9 time zones. We were well positioned to do so from an infrastructure perspective. But that didn't, of course, didn't mean that many of the impacts were felt personally by all of the network members, particularly some of our international partners who we continue to our thoughts and supports for them. Very quickly, we made a decision at the Executive Council to emphasize funding supports, particularly for students who are seeing many of their summer employment opportunities evaporate. We mobilized resources in response and to support SURF's COVID response in terms of the Rural Insight papers and, of course, this virtual conference. And we've pivoted in terms of budgets and expectations and activities from some of the major events that we were hoping to support in the last year in terms of, summarizing and really reflecting on what we've learned. And a lot of that activity is now intimately linked with SURF's strategic plan going forward. The networks themselves are all pivoting and working very hard, I think, in terms of building legacy conversations, the research centers, SURF, migration. We're having conversations at the Executive Council about how to continue supports for the Comparative Policy Studies group. And there's conversations taking place around what some of the legacy pieces are going to be. How can the established networks use those collaborations and all of that social capital for new proposals? We're using funding to support some of those projects in terms of special issues, and there's lots of consideration and conversations going on around producing edited volumes to capture some of our experience, and also discussions about how to maintain the wonderful international collaborations that RPLC has managed to foster over the last 6 years. We are also engaged in project evaluation work. We've been working as an evaluation committee. Wayne, myself, Bill Reimer is very generously donating his time and expertise to that charge, being obviously responsible for the creation of RPLC right from the very beginning. Cameron Gunton, a PhD student here at Simon Fraser University, Marco Pagini in Italy, and Bill Ashton. So we've been sort of putting our heads together, and we'll be reporting out on a variety of dimensions of the project. Governance, what can we learn about these large network projects going forward? How have we managed to build capacity throughout the entire course of the project? And of course, very importantly also, what policy impact have we had? How have we influenced policy? Have we moved the needle of rural development policy and understanding of rural development across Canada and internationally? So this is both an update and a warning. You'll be hearing from us either for interviews or, yes, another survey. There's a lot of COVID-related surveys going on. So please, when our evaluation team does contact you, it would be wonderful if you responded and we have an opportunity to collect all of your wonderful thoughts and lessons and about what we've done and lessons going forward for future projects. I'm now about to bias those conclusions of the evaluation committee, because I can say without a doubt that I think the #1 impact of RPLC has been capacity building, and it's just incredible and amazing to see all of the existing and former students who have been associated with RPLC assume leadership positions in senior governments, in local governments, in academia, and consulting, and a whole variety of agencies, and watching them approach rural policymaking with such incredible tenacity and sophistication. It is amazing to see, and without a doubt, it will be the longest lasting impact of this RPLC project, and it places rural policymaking and rural development in very good hands going forward in the future. So I look forward to seeing how those people and all the sort of the network folks who've been associated with the project continue their work going forward. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to everyone, even over the past 2 days, for sticking right to time. We are right on time, and it's fantastic. It makes the job of hosting and welcoming so much easier. So with that, I just want to say a big thank you to RPLC for all you do and for supporting SURF in so many ways, including hosting these webinars and helping us out with all the tech stuff. So we really, really do appreciate that. And with that, I think we can wrap up the welcomes, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ryan Gibson, who is going to be facilitating this panel on changing patterns in people and products. So Ryan, over to you. Thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to the rest of this great day to come.
Great, thanks for that, Kyle. Now there's pressure on me to make sure that we continue this time management that we've been experiencing so far over the last few days. Good morning to everybody. It's exciting to have you on board for this conversation as we continue the discussions of how COVID-19 is impacting rural communities. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome a wonderful panel of speakers to discuss the changing patterns of people and products across this country. As was said, my name is Ryan Gibson. I am a SURF member, and something that I would encourage everybody on the video to take a look at in terms of also exploring SURF membership for yourself. I'm delighted to facilitate this discussion, and over the next 60 minutes, we're going to share 4 presentations on the impacts of COVID-19 and then move into an open discussion. I'd encourage you, if you have any questions for the panelists, to pop them into the chat box or to the Q&A box available in Skype. You can submit your questions at any time, but we'll wait until the conclusion of the 4th presentation before we start with the responses. Before we jump into that first presentation, I wanted to remind everyone that this session builds on 4 recently published SURF Rural Insight papers, and we'll stick those into the chat box in a few seconds. But I would encourage everyone to take a look at them, to download them, and I'd also encourage everyone to share the link with colleagues that you think may be interested in these topics or should be interested in these topics to help amplify the knowledge mobilization. So with that, I'll maybe introduce each of our speakers one at a time as they are about to go. And this morning, we're going to start with a presentation from Karen Foster. Karen is the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Atlantic Futures at Dalhousie University, and she'll be sharing insights on export, imports, and local economic realities. And so I'll turn the floor over to yourself, Karen.
Great, thank you very much. So everybody can hear me okay? Got your nod, that's great. My primer and my presentation are both on imports and exports. And so what I wanted to do with the primer first and what I'll do with my time today is just talk about some of the things about rural communities that have been highlighted by the pandemic. Looking at the trade balance is something that I've been doing for a little while. It started in 2015 with a project that I worked on with the Center for Local Prosperity. And we were looking at just that, the trade balance in Atlantic Canadian communities. And we were trying to assess the potential for import replacement as an economic development strategy alongside export development, which is kind of the dominant approach in economic development in Atlantic Canada and probably around the world, most places. So the trade balance, simply put, is just the balance between imports and exports. And you can measure that at a number of different levels. The most common way to measure it is at the national level, but you can also measure it at the subnational level, and that's what we were interested in doing. While economies are, balanced between imports and exports or split between imports and exports, they also do some work to meet local needs. So the needs of local consumers, just ordinary people, as well as the needs of local businesses, intermediaries that need inputs into their own production processes. And so some of that can happen locally. There are some cases where local production meets local needs. The easiest one to think of is local food. But what we see across Canada, particularly in rural communities, is that there's less emphasis outside of the local food movement on meeting local needs with local production, and more emphasis on increasing exports. And very little emphasis on reducing imports. So we tend to see economic development happen by developers and policymakers looking at what it's possible to make and what it's possible to scale up and export as the best way to grow economies. So that is one way to balance trade. I suppose I should put this in the slideshow format. That's one way to balance trade, but there is another way. It's not going to work. Sorry, people. I think I'm going to have to leave it like that because it just goes black for me. So that is one way to balance trade, but there is another way, and that is to decrease imports, so decrease reliance on imports. Most of the economic development strategy, particularly in Atlantic Canada, focuses on growing exports. There's very little discussion about meeting local needs with local production or reducing reliance on imports. So I've just provided a couple examples of where we are export centric in our economic development. So lobster is one example. I had a heck of a time trying to find the lobster export numbers. DFO tracks the value of landings every year, but it's hard to find provincial level data on the value of exports. And the digging that I did to try and get even these numbers suggests that we actually export a lot more of the catch than this suggests. So others have tracked it and say that we actually export over half of the lobster that we land, and potentially even something like 80%. So I'm still trying to figure out where those higher estimates come from and how we can get reliable estimates. But in any case, we export a whole heck of a lot of lobster. And an even more striking example of where we prioritize exports is in haddock. So not only do we export the majority of the haddock that is caught in Nova Scotia, we export it unprocessed, typically to China, and then we buy it back from China as fillets. So we send it away, they process it, we buy it back to eat it in the form of like Captain Highliner products. And so these two things are, you know, kind of bad on their own, but they've also been the vulnerability of relying on exports for income has been illustrated by the pandemic, because lobster, for example, the demand for lobster from China just plummeted in March. And that's when a lot of the lobster fishers were out for the season. And they had to really quickly figure out how they were going to offload their catches. So at the same time as we rely on exports for income, we also rely on imports for products. And we do that, as I mentioned before, because we tend to think about export development in terms of, you know, what can we specialize in, what kind of production can we centralize and scale up, and then we kind of put all of our economic eggs in one basket, and we produce a whole lot of something that we can export. But you know, local needs are varied. You know, we need a lot of different products in smaller quantities, and so we end up relying on imports for the things that we don't make. In Atlantic Canada, where I'm based, where I do my research, we are almost always in a trade deficit position, which means that we depend on imports to satisfy our basic needs, and we export more in value than, we import more in value than we export. So we're not even really playing our export led growth game very well. And COVID revealed that this strategy is, it's risky, and it's really vulnerable to external shocks, which the pandemic is. And as you can imagine, it's really stark in places that are small and that don't have very diversified economies, and that have really focused on, just extracting or catching or farming or developing one product that has a really big export market, because as soon as that goes away, as in the case of a pandemic, the whole community can be thrown into a really bad situation. So in my primer, I talk a little bit about what import replacement might look like. This is an idea that we, it predates Jane Jacobs, but for my previous research, we really took Jane Jacobs' articulation of import replacement, and we suggested that it would make sense as a different kind of economic development strategy, particularly for rural places, and it really would have to unfold on a regional level. But the idea would be that that communities or regions would focus on meeting local needs with local production, and that they would of course still import certain things. They would still export, their specialties, but a whole lot more of just the normal everyday needs and consumption would be satisfied by local production. And Jane Jacobs believed that this was the best or only way to develop sustainable, truly sustainable regional economies. And so with that in mind, in my primer, I made a few recommendations. One was just that we kind of shift the way we think about economic development, particularly in rural places, and focus more on import replacement. It's more complicated because it means, you don't just have to have a sense of where the trends are in international markets. You also have to have a measurement of local needs. What are we importing a lot of that it would be possible to produce here? We're probably not going to grow mangoes in Newfoundland, but there are probably lots of intermediate products, and definitely food. Food is pardon the pun, but it's usually a low-hanging fruit in import replacement. There are things that you can produce locally that you don't need to import, and you can reduce your reliance on external markets and reduce your vulnerability to external shocks. So one of my recommendations is to rethink export-led development. One of the things you need to do that is to collect and publicize better community level trade data. It's really hard to find trade data at the sub-national level. And I'm hopeful that the throne speech, it alluded to better disaggregated data. So I'm hoping that this might mean some more community level data, including trade data. I recommended looking at import replacement through local procurement. So I am part of an organization right now that's pursuing this in some pilot studies of how do you do import replacement through local procurement. So looking at large institutions that rely on imports. So for example, hospitals that import food from outside of their province that really could be sourced from within the province. We're trying to look at what are the barriers to local procurement and what are the opportunities, because with institutional procurement, you have a really big chunk of local consumption right there, and you don't have to deal with the complexity involved in ordinary people's consumption habits. It's a different kind of complexity. The fourth recommendation that I made was to encourage local consumption. So it might seem kind of trite, but buy local campaigns, offering incentives for local production, for local consumption rather, local currencies, although they've been tested out with mixed results are another way to encourage local consumption. And one of the ones that I think is showing a lot of promise now is direct marketing. So, consumer supported agriculture is an example of that, where producers are selling directly to consumers without going through a middleman. And in some cases, they are pre-selling their products. And another area that's underexplored, I think, is enabling local investment. So enabling people to actually invest in local businesses and have the possibility of a return instead of having to throw your money into mutual funds that have typically no attachment to a local community. So that's my presentation. I was in the middle of, I realized that I forgot to add my references at the end. So here's some incomplete references, but if anybody has a question about where I got any of the data or sources, I can send references out after.
Thank you for that presentation, Karen. And there's been a few questions in the chat box. I'll let you take a read of those, and when we get to the Q&A part, you may be able to provide some commentary on that. Let's continue our discussion, and we're going to move from the East Coast, where Karen is located, over to Ontario here. And I would invite both Emily Sousa and Sara Epp to join us, and we'll turn our attention to how COVID-19 has impacted agriculture and the agri-food sector. Emily is a master's student in the Rural Planning and Development program at the University of Guelph, and Sara is an assistant professor in the Rural Planning and Development program at the University of Guelph. And so I'll turn the proverbial floor over to Emily and Sara to share their screen and their presentation.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Ryan. Hello, everybody. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Emily Sousa, and I'm a Master's of Planning candidate at the University of Guelph. I'll be presenting with Dr. Sara Epp. In our presentation, we will be speaking to the impacts of COVID-19 to agriculture and agri-food, speaking specifically to the issue, specific impacts, responses, and subsequently our recommendations emerging from initial analysis of the issue. So just a note that, of course, our presentation is very brief and we will only be skimming the surface of what we've written about in our Surf Rural Insights paper. So if you are interested, I highly encourage you to check it out. I believe the links have been provided in the chat. So on to the challenge. Many sectors and businesses in agriculture and agri-food continue their operations amidst widespread pandemic-related closures in other businesses and sectors across the country. Simple reason is because agriculture and agri-food are critical to feeding Canadians and, of course, our economies. Agriculture is diverse and is a system, so our discussion of the issue at hand focuses on components all throughout the value chain. Specifically, we will speak to production, processing, distribution, and consumption patterns. We will provide a quick overview of the impacts, but the key thing to note here is that these issues do not operate in isolation from one another, and they are integrated into other components of our local, regional, and national food systems. So despite operating with some degree of normalcy and resilience, the sector did face and continues to face several challenges related to COVID. Many of the issues have persisted for a long time in our food system, even before the onset of the global pandemic. And what COVID has done is that it has shone a light on these issues and brought them up to the forefront, in addition to highlighting the underappreciated strengths of our food system. So as we will discuss, overcoming challenges requires diverse, context-specific responses grounded in community and governmental collaboration and cooperation. So on to the impacts. Within the scope of agriculture and agri-food, COVID-19 has brought several ever-evolving and quickly shifting impacts. At the start of the pandemic, it seemed like a new issue and response was emerging each and every day. Even though labor shortages have been an issue in agricultural production and processing sectors over the last few decades, COVID-19 heightened these concerns. The heightened concern over labor shortages resulted from delays in seasonal agricultural workers' arrivals, due to travel restrictions, costs, and regulations associated with quarantining and accommodation, as well as some outbreaks happening on farms, as we saw. Without farm workers, rifts can be felt all throughout the food system, including in the harvest, supply, distribution, and import and export of fresh and processed goods all across the country. We saw this at the height of the pandemic with early season crops, such as with asparagus. Some farmers were not able to harvest in time due to delayed arrivals of their workers. We also saw distribution networks shift significantly. For example, hospitality and tourism demand evidently dropped, and all the food typically produced and sold to restaurants had to be rerouted elsewhere, such as in grocery stores or for food banks. This may explain why some consumers were getting restaurant packaged steaks or larger cartons of eggs in stores. Similarly, we saw drops in demand for certain goods, leading to excess supply, the need to reroute foods, and in some unfortunate cases, actually waste food. An example is in the rapid drop in demand for dairy products, which is a highly perishable good. This resulted in dairy farmers and processors all across the country needing to dump milk. Similarly, we saw closures of meat processing plants all across North America due to COVID outbreaks, resulting in processing backlogs and losses to farmers.
All right, so importantly, we've seen a response from all three levels of government across the country, and I'll briefly highlight a few examples from each. The most significant response from the federal government has been financially based and largely related to farm labor. We have seen this through reinvestment in the Skills for Youth Employment Program and subsidies paid to farmers to assist with accommodating seasonal workers that traveled from outside Canada through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. New policies required safety measures related to worker housing, as well as a mandatory quarantine for all workers entering Canada. Federal subsidies were intended to help cover costs associated with these measures, with an ultimate goal of reducing the risk of exposure to COVID-19 for these workers. If you followed this topic, you will of course know that there have been several outbreaks of COVID-19 within the agri-food sector. Within Ontario, it's been reported that approximately 1,300 migrant workers have contracted the virus, and sadly, at least 3 have died. Kathleen's presentation yesterday briefly highlighted this topic, and in speaking with many individuals working in the Niagara region this summer, I can echo her sentiments that the fear of contracting the virus was an extremely common concern among the workers, as well as for their families back home. Provincially, we have seen responses related to improving online connections for the agri-food sector with a focus on career opportunities. Agri-food jobs are abundant, but the skills required and jobs available are not always clearly communicated. These portals have been an excellent tool to demystify many labor aspects of the agri-food sector and highlight opportunities for new entrants into the field, importantly, including young individuals. Finally, responses from the local level have been incredibly diverse, innovative, and impactful. Many of these initiatives has sought to relocalize food supply chains and enhance direct-to-consumer sales. We saw this through broad support for farmers markets and creative solutions for ensuring markets were open as food was ready for sale. This included things like getting the markets outside if they were in indoor venues. The local farmers market where I am had security, keeping track of how many people were in there and making sure barriers and distances were maintained. The image on this slide highlights a locally driven example from Northern Ontario, where issues of sustained and consistent access to food were heightened. In response to this issue, and in recognition that of course agriculture does occur in the North, a group of citizens created a Facebook page, Farm to Table, in an effort to connect consumers with producers and relocalize their food system. The data generated by farmers in this group has been transformed into an interactive map that houses all of this information in a central and searchable format. The map, similar to the Farm to Table group, is ever evolving, but demonstrates the impact of local initiatives, the value of local knowledge, and passion of local residents. So for our recommendations, this slide really only provides a really brief overview of the recommendations from our paper. Foundational to these recommendations is the need to collaborate, and I hope I have shown that collaboration must occur between all levels of government. With that said, some of the most immediate and innovative solutions have been at the local level, which demonstrates the importance of supporting local government and maybe more importantly, local leadership. But we can only move forward and find solutions if we have open dialogue throughout the agri-food sector, recognizing not only the challenges and vulnerabilities, but also the opportunities. As I look at the last few recommendations on this slide, I'm reminded of a news clip from the spring of a high school student who I believe was in an urban community commenting on the lack of jobs that were available due to COVID-19 and interested in opportunities to work on a farm for the summer. In response, the reporter laughed. And it wasn't a laugh of interest, it was a laugh of diminishing. Why would this student ever want to work on a farm? Not only does this response diminish the value of agricultural work, but it significantly deters new and young entrants from the field, and no one benefits from that type of response. The pandemic has certainly reminded us of the value of agriculture and that we must support education and training, do a better job of communicating the diverse career opportunities available in the sector, and welcome new entrants into the field. So with our extremely brief overview there, we would like to thank everyone for listening. I'll speak on behalf of Emily as well, recognizing as well that Wayne Caldwell was an author on this paper. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to present, although I do think he's here today listening as well, so that's always great. And I know both Emily and myself are excited to hear the discussion questions and participate in that panel.
Great, thank you very much, Emily and Sara, for that presentation. As Sara mentioned, you can add any of your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I'd encourage Emily and Sara to take a look at those related to the agriculture and agri-food section that have emerged. At this time, though, we're going to continue with our third presentation in this session, and I would invite Lou and Ray to join us. Lou is a PhD student in the Rural Studies program at the University of Guelph, and Ray Silvius is an associate professor of political science at the University of Winnipeg, and they're going to share some perspectives of how COVID-19 has impacted newcomers and migrants in rural communities.
This is a presentation based on a primer prepared by myself with Dr. Ray Silvius and Dr. Ryan Gibson, who is of course facilitating this discussion today about how we can support newcomers and migrants in rural Canada during and after COVID-19. And as the title suggests, I think it's important to think about this problem or this issue, along with many of the other issues that we're looking at today, as the result of systemic and existing problems that were already there, but that have been brought to the forefront of our attention by the pandemic, and that we need to think about these in the long term, going beyond COVID, for how we can build our rural communities in ways that are better for everyone. Oh, hold on. I made a mistake there. Oh no. Okay, there we go. So to start, I'm going to give you some introduction to what immigration in rural Canada looks like and why it is important for us to talk about these issues. So roughly, according to Statistics Canada, roughly 1 in 10 newcomers settle in rural areas and small towns, which is a definition that is based on places with a population of less than 10,000. And so while that does not sound like a lot, and it is certainly not a majority of newcomers to Canada, it is still a substantial number of people when you think about how many thousands of people come to Canada every year. In addition to being a large number of people, it is also a fairly diverse group of people. Rural Canada is home to newcomers, including both economic and family class immigrants, refugees, international students on our rural university and college campuses, and of course, temporary foreign workers on our farms and in our food production facilities. Despite how many and how varied this group of people is, rural immigration is often underrepresented in media and migration studies compared to urban immigration. Immigration as a whole tends to be viewed as an urban issue, which is of course a misrepresentation of a very complex issue. And when we think about immigration as an urban issue exclusively, it leaves a lot of potential for blind spots, including a lack of academic attention on the issues that are specific to rural immigrants, as well as a lack of funding for immigrant settlement services in rural areas. And of course, in the context of the pandemic, attention towards the ways that it is affecting rural immigrants. So first and foremost, I think one of the most important ways in which we need to talk about the impact of COVID on immigrants to rural Canada is the impact of COVID on agri-food migrant labor. So as we heard in the previous presentation, actually, migrant labor is a very prominent part of the overall agri-food workforce and continues to grow as a portion of the overall workforce, to the point where in 2018, it was found that temporary foreign workers, or TFWs, made up over 20% of the Canadian agri-food workforce, and this is a number that's growing. So despite how important these workers are to our food systems and to rural economies, they're left vulnerable in several specific ways that are becoming apparent during the pandemic. First of all, there is a very real risk to them of financial losses. As we've heard, the pandemic has been devastating towards the agricultural sector, but it has also been devastating towards many of these workers who either arrived late or were unable to arrive at all. And since a lot of government relief for the unemployed has been through things like the Canadian Economic Emergency Response Benefit, is geared towards residents of Canada, of course, it is unclear if any of these workers have been able to access that economic relief to help them through this crisis. Additionally, they are vulnerable in many ways to poor health and safety, and this has long been an issue with these programs, that researchers have found that due to the systemic inequality of their status as temporary residents and the large amount of power that their employers have over their ability to stay and work in Canada, workers are more likely to accept unsafe and unhealthy working and living conditions. And this has already played out during the pandemic in the course of some of these very large outbreaks of COVID on farms and in food processing facilities that we've of course heard about. Finally, they are at risk of marginalization and isolation. This is another thing that has long been an issue with these programs, but is particularly an issue now, seeing as it is inadvisable for them to go out and interact with people in the communities where they are staying. So in summary, I think it's important to think about this issue in terms of both the risk of the vulnerability of these workers to our food systems and our rural communities, but also we need to think about these people, these workers, as members of our rural communities that we need to take care of just as we would any other members, because despite their temporary status, they are very much a feature of these communities that we need to think about moving forward. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ray. Ray, you're on mute.
Great, thank you. So Lou covered the landscape of temporary foreign workers, and this group may have received, insofar as newcomers and temporary foreign workers receive any sort of media publicity during COVID, they've received perhaps more than all of the other classifications of newcomers and workers that reside in Canada's rural areas and smaller centers. Now, this latter group, we have great difficulty in actually learning about during the pandemic. So what we are seeing in our brief here is it's not quite speculation, but it's trying to lay out a roadmap of how to think about the various groups of newcomers that find themselves in our rural communities. The full extent of COVID disruptions on these groups is unclear, but what we do know is that all classes of newcomers, immigrants, refugees, refugee claimants, temporary foreign workers, the systems that have them arrive in rural Canada and the systems that sustain them while they are in rural Canada have been massively disrupted during COVID-19. We know that the Immigration Refugee Board of Canada has perhaps the largest backlog of refugee claims cases outstanding right now for refugee claimants. We know that just between the onset of the pandemic and now, roughly 1,000 refugees have been resettled to Canada. You can imagine what proportion of those have been resettled to rural areas. So we know that these groups have been disrupted in their arrival and resettlement and settlement in rural Canada. We know that for those that are there already, their lives are massively compromised along the lines that many people are experiencing right now during the pandemic, with an asterisk, because in many cases they're attempting to prolong their stay in Canada in some cases, or settle in areas and become fully fledged members of the community. So we also know, I should mention, that as Lou alluded to, international students comprise a part of this group. And like all post-secondary students right now, lives are extremely disrupted during the pandemic. Again, with the asterisks that they may be dealing with residence issues, they may be dealing with uncertain status, and they may be dealing with some of the lack of community supports that newcomers typically face in rural areas in Canada and in urban centers for that matter. So what we know is that the systems have been disrupted and that isolation and uncertainty have amplified. We also know that many newcomers have experienced increased incidences of racism during the pandemic due to some of the racialized targeting towards East Asians, as the early months of the pandemic demonstrated, but in other ways as well. So Lou, if you could change the slide, please. So we need to think about how we support the newcomers in rural areas, and we need to think about how we support those whose job it is to support newcomers in rural areas. And this brings us to rural immigrant settlement service providing organizations. Now, like everybody's work life, those who are charged with the task of providing settlement services in rural areas in Canada have had their work lives upended tremendously during COVID-19. They, like many others, have had this happen whilst also facing incredible new demands on their time for their services amongst their clientele and those whom they serve. So it can be argued that their work is now more essential than ever, in spite of the fact that our new arrivals might be diminishing due to the disruptions in Canadian immigration systems. Nonetheless, to serve the existing group of newcomers in rural areas takes a tremendous amount of effort under pandemic circumstances. This is due to some things that we're all familiar with in terms of needing to socially distance, the difficulty of conducting in-person meetings. But when it comes to serving newcomers in rural areas, some of the added challenges are distributing timely COVID-relevant information to a diverse group of newcomers with diverse languages, to helping fill out employment and income assistance forms or the CERB, and all manner of things that are required to ensure economic well-being during the pandemic. So we know that from some of our partners in the field that this is the experience, but we also know that their work is being challenged by an adherence to funding models which tend to reimburse, or rather finance organizations according to new arrivals. And so during COVID, we need to find ways to reimagine how to support those who support newcomers in the rural area with some more supportive funding and financing schemes. If you could advance, thank you. So quickly, I won't read the final slide out here. I would encourage you to look at our recommendations, which are spelled out more in full. I would like to conclude here briefly by stating that I think we're at a stage right now where we can more confidently research the groups under discussion here. newcomers in rural areas and those who support newcomers. And so there is an immediate need for collaboration between policy makers, researchers, and a heightened amount of coordination amongst those who are directly impacted by some of the things that we've talked about. And we would welcome all of you to discuss how we might collectively do this moving forward as the pandemic continues. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Lou, for that wonderful presentation. We will encourage people to put their comments in the chat box there around that presentation on newcomers to rural communities. And in the interim, before we get to all those questions, we're going to invite our fourth presentation, and that is from Victoria Agyepong, who is a Master's of Rural Development, a Rural Planning and Development student at the University of Guelph. And Victoria is also the Supervisor of Labor Market Analysis and Employer Engagement with Skills for Change. Victoria is going to be sharing some insights on the impact of COVID-19 on rural employment and workforce development and some considerations for moving forward. So I'll turn the floor over to yourself, Victoria.
Hi, Ryan, and it's a pleasure to see you again. I'm Victoria again, and I'm a master's student at School of Environmental Studies and in Rural Development at the University of Guelph. And I'm pretty excited to be here to share my experience during this COVID and what everybody is itching to know, what it means to rural and small town areas. So as a budding rural researcher, 7 years ago, I longed for clean air, a slower pace of life, fresh food, and a closer-knit community. Eventually, I landed in Guelph, and I had a singular aspiration to lead and engage more in research and policy initiatives. Then COVID hit. Then any hope in getting meaningful employment in Canada seemed bleak as job cuts became the norm. Then there was a big pilgrimage to rural Canada, and suddenly rural and smaller towns became a mixed-use community thanks to working from home. All kumbaya, right? But not necessarily. So myself, Ray, and Dr. Gibson sought to explore what COVID-19 really meant to employment and workforce development in rural and small town areas. There we go. So in the context of workforce development and employment, rural is not a one-dimensional term, but is defined in terms of population size and distance to a larger urban center. So what this means is that if you got a job in a smaller community, which is near to a metro center, then your spouse is more likely to find a job in the metro center, and both of you could benefit from the shared services between the rural and urban community. So here, wage competition and employment quality becomes a bigger issue for rural businesses and local governments. If you found a job in a larger but remote community, then you are likely to have access to regional services, but your partner is constrained to searching for jobs within the community. And you may not find affordable housing because of the low housing demand and developers not having interest to develop there. Now, if you were living in a smaller and more remote community, then you'd recognize that the community lacks the large workforce to attract or retain businesses, and are usually dependent on one key sector and usually lack adequate and affordable broadband that is needed to benefit from remote human resources. Also, the lower staff capacity at the local government level to provide workforce development and settlement services make it more difficult to retain newcomers and working parents. So with this diversity in rurality, it is not surprising that the number of people retiring exceed the number of people entering the workforce, especially in rural Canada. So when COVID hit in July, the impact on percent employment reduction was minus 8.3% in rural and small town areas, compared to minus 6.2% in larger urban centers. But this gap has been closing in recent months. However, employment in sectors requiring physical interactions experienced an increased percent of job losses due to higher consumer demand for less physical interaction and automated processes during COVID. Also, deeming most rural service sectors as non-essential increased employment reductions in those sectors. However, the role of automation in these rural employment and occupation growth dynamics need to be monitored closely so that we can see the impact more clearly according to the rural or small town type that we discussed earlier. Now, these reductions in rural employment also has demographic dimensions. Although earlier, younger workers experienced the largest unemployment of -30%, more recently, rural workers aged 55 or more are topping the list and at -21% as of July. Irrespective of age group or whether urban or rural, the impact of COVID-19 was higher for working women. So single parents are forced to decide between caregiving and employment, whereas couple parents decide who cares, who works, and how. So age and gender matters really in rural employment and recovery policies. There is an incentive also for employers to hire part-time workers on contractors to avoid paying benefits, such as enhanced healthcare, pension contributions, paid leave, and professional development and training opportunities. But it remains to be seen whether COVID-19 will accelerate these trends, especially as we're looking forward to a second wave. Net migration from metro and partially metro areas is the least contributing factor to population growth in RST areas, but it's followed closely by the number of births minus number of deaths. Net immigration topped the charts, as my colleague earlier mentioned, but move to more teleworking may facilitate more geographic moves from urban to rural. At least 16% of potential rural labor market entrants in Canada are Indigenous peoples. However, Indigenous peoples experience higher high school non-completion rates and lower unemployment rates in RST areas. Meanwhile, challenges with labor force readiness among Indigenous youth and young people are predominantly institutional and cultural based. Nonetheless, support for more data analysis of international immigration, Indigenous population and migration inflows using RST classification need to be funded so that the trends within the three types of rural areas can be monitored. Because as I clearly explained, the impact depends on what kind of rural area you live in. So we made a couple of considerations for sustainable recovery based on our findings. The first bit has to do with employment quality. And we believe that multi-governance forums looking at both employers and employee needs through wide engagement, especially with community leaders of rural areas with high social capital on work terms, can strengthen labor market standards based on the type of rural area. For most affected demographics, such as working parents and senior workers, government should fund community services to maintain and improve employment quality in RST areas. For instance, benchmarking the childcare affordability initiatives on both household income level and the median childcare rate of the different economic regions of RST areas would be a good start. At the moment, we only benchmark both based on just the household income, which does not really consider the case of affordability. Another issue is considering the limitations of implementing universal childcare. So the assumption is that if we implement universal childcare, then everyone, including people, working parents in rural areas, would have childcare, right? But that ignores the lack of services that are available also in rural areas and how to actually deliver that even when you have universal. So you can have universal childcare, but if you don't have access to services, then it's pretty useless if you are living in a rural area that doesn't have that. The next issue that I wanted to be also identified was sustaining productivity. So some urban labor experts have been proposing 30-hour weeks with result-only work environment and 4-day work weeks, which are exciting, but government needs to also consider that RST employers lack the human capacity to offer these task-based jobs. to attract task-based workers or undertake virtual and project-based and performance assessments, which are required to ensure that productivity is maintained in rural and small-town areas, especially if you are struggling with broadband issues. So funding is required to enable rural organizations such as Community Futures to support employers with training programs and technologies to sustain and grow productivity that are based on local priorities. And the third point that we have was that government funding should also explore the mainstreaming of career pathway programs to support on-demand skill development at post-secondary institutions and with employers to meet the demand of rural employment service providers and employers in regions, especially for regions that are creating less risky jobs or losing jobs at high risk of automation. We believe that the universal provision of on-demand and early skill-based training will be essential in helping rural and small-town area workers participate in career latticing. So what career latticing means is that increasingly as we're having job cuts, it becomes very useful for you to have transferable skills that you can use in other sectors. But then you'd need a bit more training to be able to enter that new work sector or new work environment that you want to transfer your skills to, because maybe you experienced loss of jobs because your job was automated. And these availability of on-demand and early skill-based training in rural areas also allows rural workers to participate. The next point we had was that RST communities constitute up to 37% of Canada's community and are usually underserved in terms of public services and affordable housing compared to their urban counterparts. So strengthening rural higher education and vocational educational institutions, making quality and affordable broadband infrastructure universal service, or match funding inter-community efforts to provide broadband service in rural and small-town areas will foster rural social skills ecosystem and enable rural areas to retain and attract remote jobs, remote workers, and remote businesses. The fifth point that we had was, which is last by one point, was that all levels of government need to promote and support innovative approaches which use collaborative partnerships to integrate cross-cultural competencies related to indigenous cultures and multiculturalism. And I think my colleague was talking a bit more about that when he was talking about 1 in 10 newcomers landing in rural areas and not really being having the services to really integrate with their cultures. So we normally talk about welcoming communities, but then we are promoting more of having welcoming environments where one's culture fits in and they can see properly how their culture can cross-interrelate with the existing local culture. And then with that, we can be able to build stronger economies. Another issue that we observed was that it will be very useful for governments to fund and create mechanisms to gather data on the incidence, nature, and source of racism experienced by Indigenous, Black, and newcomers in rural and small town areas. Again, I'll emphasize on the use of, on the value of us having this at a rural and small town classification, because then it helps us to see how those experiences vary based on spatial differences. Like I mentioned, that rurality is not necessarily a one-dimensional thing. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was that we also observed that, again, on data, that it was really hard to assess the impact of employment on different facets, because sometimes you'd have to be forced to use metro classifications, which is a very different thing from assessing based on the two-dimensional situation that we're mentioning. So we're suggesting that businesses and government and community organizations require these relevant rural data to make evidence-based decisions. So it will be around skill training, changes in employment, or market trends. So partnerships with post-secondary institutions and national rural organizations can facilitate data analysis relevant to communities and businesses. So let's sponsor rural so that rural becomes the ideal place to work, live, and earn. This is just an overview of all that we researched on, and if for more details, you can always have a look at the document that we published. And we are looking forward to your discussions and questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria, for that presentation on employment and workforce development. And actually, a huge congratulations to all of the presenters this morning, now early afternoon, for your discussion. And there have been a number of questions posted as people were chatting. And I see there was even some live responses that we're going through. But maybe we could start with a question that was posted in the Q&A box. And maybe, Karen, you might be interested in starting this discussion. David Douglas asks that a major consideration for communities attempting to import substitution or replacement strategy is scale. How can we produce for smaller markets?
Yeah, and I read the rest of the question, kind of laid out that bigger businesses, multinationals often benefit from economies of scale, and that local products can cost more. And so therefore, if you're relying on local production, products are going to cost local consumers more. That is not necessarily the case. And we have to remember that we're not just talking about products, we're also talking about services, or we're not only talking about goods rather, and the economies of scale on services are not as great. So I think any of us just have to, walk around our communities, whether we're rural or urban, and you can point to a great number of examples of small businesses that are successful, that pay a decent wage, that have been going for years, if not decades, and that specialize in one product that has a good local market. So I think that we need to look at those, look at the success stories, see if they can be replicated in whatever industry it is that we are looking at. I do think that, was it David? Yeah, raises a good question in that, if local products tend to be more expensive, or if we're usually talking about the craft version of a product, does that mean that an import substitution strategy is going to benefit rich people and leave people with lower incomes to patronize the Walmarts and other big multinational firms? I do think that's a valuable question, but I think that the first and easiest step towards encouraging more small local businesses is to remove the great incentives and tax breaks and subsidies and every other kind of corporate attraction scheme that regional development authorities have, to dismantle those, to at least level the playing field by not pouring all of this money and bureaucratic time into attracting big firms, because that's where you get into that problem of dependence on a single employer and the boom and bust cycle.
Great, thanks for that response, Karen. I'm maybe going to turn the next question to, and maybe it's a starting point for Sara and for Emily. And the question was posed by Megan, and it's around the fact that how do we resolve the apparent contradiction between the fact that government is often the reason for ag supply chain issues and food production problems, and at the same time, they're supposed to be the solution. And so what is the evidence that government has the capacity or the interest in stepping in to solve this dilemma?
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan and Megan, for posing that question. Sara, if you don't mind, maybe I'll take this first, and then if you have anything to add, you can chime in.
Sure.
Okay. So once again, thank you, Megan, for your question. So I wouldn't say that government alone is necessarily the reason for our agricultural supply chain issues and problems. As we discussed, agriculture is diverse, supply chain has many players, and arguably other players in our overall historic economic trajectory and mindset in agricultural production of food, fiber, and fuel, because agriculture produces more than just food, has led us to where we are today. Of course, Government and the regulatory context has a role, but I wouldn't paint it with a broad brush and saying that it is their role specifically is contradictory to supporting local networks. So in saying that, for example, I'll draw on the example of Ontario because I'm most familiar with that context. With the recent update of our provincial policy statement is now stated as a provincial priority that our provincial and municipal governments adopt an agricultural systems approach to land use planning and regulatory matters. Specifically, the need to view agriculture as a system. There are places for all actors in our rural communities, and supporting a diversity of endeavors in our land use plans and regulations is key to supporting the rural and agricultural sector. This includes large-scale and small-scale operations. COVID is a time to reflect on the policies and see where we have maybe fallen short. And to say, I think that there are certainly municipalities on the ground, ones that I've been speaking to, are working to address these gaps. Also, with respect to the drop in the bucket comment, and maybe looks good on Instagram, with respect to local food actors. When we refer to local food, we aren't necessarily referring exclusively to small scale ma and pa farming and agri-food operations. Certainly we are including them. Like we said, agriculture is diverse, and many small scale or family farm operations are large and actually incorporated. So the diversity of actors helps to fill in gaps for service delivery where maybe corporate or commercial food system might fall short. For example, we drew on the example of the few companies who control meat processing in the country, and they were forced to shut down because of outbreaks. People may have turned to local butchers or local markets to fill in that gap there. And Sara, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Maybe just add that I think, and I hate saying the benefit of the pandemic, but I think the benefit of the pandemic is it's forcing us to review the existing system and seeing those sort of faults and cracks and failures that came out when the pandemic hit. I mean, the empty grocery stores was the best example of that fear for sure, but why the big system that we have right now and the policies that have supported it are a challenge. And I'll just refer to the North because I've spent time up there and I've done quite a bit of research there. In the North, there was a recognition that the issues were even more heightened in regards to access to food. And so this relocalization was an immediate response to try to figure out how to stabilize food systems. And so the pandemic has really forced that immediate sort of response. And I think those local pieces and those small ones may be drops, but I think those drops add up really fast over time. And for the farmers that were maybe most impacted by those sudden shifts, those drops were significant to maintaining their operations. And depending on the residents, I mean, yes, absolutely. Some local food is extremely expensive. Depending on what you're purchasing, it's not priced for everyone in the market. I can speak to, so I'm in the Niagara region right now. Farmers in some situations reserve the second, so the not pristine Instagram worthy produce at a lower price for those who couldn't purchase at the higher price that perfect vegetable maybe demands. And in a lot of instances, those markets where they didn't exist before the pandemic, the seconds were selling out almost instantly because it was a way to get access to local food and fresh food that most didn't know about before the pandemic, or that just came up because of the pandemic.
Great, thanks for that. The next question will maybe turn to Lou and to Ray. And this was a question from Peter with regards to, is there any data around how long the 1 in 10 immigrants that are moving to Canada that reside in rural areas stay in rural communities? So this notion of, do they stay when they arrive in rural Canada? Any insights on that? And we might even tag Ray here as well. He may have some insight. But Lou, Ray.
Thanks for the question, Ryan. I don't have data on that. And in my experience, such data is incredibly difficult to come by for the simple fact that mobility is high and it's difficult to track immigration categories over time. So once one receives permanent residence status or citizenship, as many newcomers will, it's in my experience quite difficult to determine the length of time that they reside in a given locale, be it rural or urban. So unfortunately, I can't answer that question. It's a great one though.
Excellent.
I would add to that I think that in a lot of rural communities experience that want to attract immigrants or newcomers, an equally challenging half of that issue, along with attracting them, is retaining them once they're there, because of course there are a lot of obstacles, such as a lack of existing services for them, which we kind of covered in our presentation, but also a lack of existing cultural communities, religious communities that often sort of provide the social capital for integrating those newcomers into the community in urban areas that have more of an existing immigrant population. So I would expect that retention rates in rural areas in general are likely to be poorer than in urban areas. But like Ray said, I don't have the data on that, and I think it would be hard to come by.
Great. And I'll just draw people's attention to the chat box there. Karen shared a wonderful resource from some colleagues around the experience in Atlantic Canada. Did you want to say a bit more about that, Karen? You give away the spoiler.
I navigated away to try and I'll find the actual link and post it. But I think it's relevant because Atlantic Canada is one of those places where, you know, it's not predominantly, but it's very rural. So I'll find the resource and post it.
Wonderful. Sorry, Victoria, did you want to say something?
I wanted to chime in a bit. Victoria SS did a very wonderful research on rural, what attracts immigrants and what retains them. And what was interesting though is that the factors that attract immigrants are the same factors that retain them. So, but then the big question becomes, so why is it that when they come, they leave? So then they come with a perception that all these factors were going to be available because we're coming to this developed country. But then they get there and then they realize quickly that, okay, I'm not only not going to have these services, but I'm going to struggle to even make friends. I'm going to struggle for my spouse to even get a job, which is a big driving factor for working families. So that's something. Imagine if you came as an immigrant to a place and you came with your child, and your child's next school has to be like 3 schools away. That becomes a challenge. Or maybe your child happens to be friends with just 4 other kids in the whole school is just 5 kids. And let's say that 5 kids, they are now threatening to close down the school because it's not enough people that are keeping the school alive. That's questionable, something that working parents who are immigrants, which is the case because mostly people who are migrating migrate as families. It becomes something that does not encourage them to retain. So that's why I think what Lou was bringing out across that the importance of having settlement services and maybe having cross-community shares. Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Ryan just shared Victoria's work. It becomes very, very useful at looking realistically, what are the local assets that we have as a rural community and how can we use that in rather to attract people and retain them. Then when the person is coming in, they have the realistic situation before they come in, and then they understand how they can survive when they are there, right? Because people are living there and have survived living there. It's not like a place to survive, but a place to really live and have a meaningful life. But we have to be able to sell that so that the whole urban concept doesn't become the same reason why someone moved from their home country. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Ray, I think you had a comment that you wanted to pass along.
Yeah, and I would echo what a few people have just said here, that I think there's a propensity to think of newcomers. Obviously, I'm not a newcomer. I can't get in the headspace, but to think of newcomers as a fundamentally different type of human being in rural or urban areas. But I think we ought to remember that the same reason why a smaller center might exhibit population increase or decline for those who already exist in that place would probably have the same effect on newcomers, with the additional proviso that it might be that there's an even smaller community, religious, ethnocultural base for newcomers in said communities. And I'd also maybe suggest that We're seeing in Manitoba here, it's mostly anecdotal at this point, but secondary, if not tertiary movement, an intra-rural movement of newcomers, going from different agricultural and food processing sectors to the next in different rural areas. And I think the simple factor there is the quality of the job that awaits one at a new destination and the ability to reside there. So we have to ensure that we're considering the quality of work life for any given newcomer as a determining factor in their ability and desire to stay in the smaller center.
Great, thank you for that. We've got a few more questions that I've got here, and I've been monitoring most of the different places. And this is a question for Emily and for Sara, coming from Heather Hall. And Heather says she's leading a project looking at the impacts of disruptive technologies in the agri-food sector and wondering if you think COVID-19 is going to accelerate the pace of adoption of automated and other so-called labor-saving technologies on farms. And I'd also suggest maybe Victoria, you might like to comment on that after Sara and Emily.
Sure, so I can start on that one. I think it depends on the type of egg we're talking about. Tender fruit, as an example, it's labor intensive. I don't know that as of yet there's any technology that can pick peaches without bruising them, as an example. I think we definitely do see the shift, though, of changing out the crops that are grown for those that are less labor intensive. It was happening pre-pandemic extensively in a lot of areas that were tender fruit, again, as an example, and sort of a switch to things like grapes that can be picked by machine and ignored. I don't know if you can hear my phone ringing right now. So I think it depends on the industry. I think it was already happening, or the type of egg at least. It was already happening pre-pandemic. It will likely increase, and you will see probably farmers switching to those that are less labor intensive, or increase the rate that they adopt technology if it's available and if it's cost effective. Because the bottom line at the end of the day is, does a farmer have a buyer for their product, and are they going to make a living regardless of the size of the producer?
Yeah, I echo all of Sarah's comments on that. I was going to say the same thing, saying it depends on the sector, and this was happening before. So yeah, maybe I'll give Victoria the opportunity to chime in.
So I think I agree with Sarah. Like, it depends on. So then the good thing is, with the OECD research that we have a very clear, it could be clearer for rural sense of that there are some sectors that are closing in because of the risk of automation, and those that are opening up, right? So what that does, though, is it gives you a kind of an idea at which sectors are more susceptible to technology, like are more likely to adopt more technology. I think it's something that would probably have to look deeper for agri-food as well, because not all, like Sarah clearly mentioned, not all agri-food can be automated, or even can be automated efficiently. I remember us having a visit to one farmer in, I think, Blight, and he was really giving us an example of how, even though there is a higher automation for robotic milking and things like that, there are certain things that looking at the cost efficiency of doing that, it was just not reasonable for them to adopt it now. So the bigger question that we start looking at is, okay, so there's this automation, there's this technology. Which agri-food sectors are more susceptible to this? Is that cost efficient for them? And also, is it something that is more service driven, or it's more goods driven? So for COVID-19, the thing that we are realizing more is the service driven automations are what has been boosted, and not necessarily the goods production automation. So then, and it's purely because more and more people are not wanting to physically interact because of the way the disease spreads. And that's something to really look closely at, especially for rural areas.
Great. Could I put Ray Bollman on the spot in terms of maybe sharing some of the work that has been done with the Rural Ontario Institute, and that's maybe Ontario specific, but around some of that employment perspectives?
Thanks, Ryan, I guess. Well, on the impact, excuse me, on the impact of COVID on employment in Ontario. The Rural Ontario Institute has published some special issues of their focus on rural Ontario fact sheets, just documenting how far employment in each of the last few months has been below the level of employment in previous months, the same month in the previous year. And certainly there's also charts at the Canada level. Now, at the Canada level, employment in rural has been hit harder than the employment in urban, so that rural is down here and urban is up here, and they're getting back, but not very close to where they were a year ago. In the last month in Ontario, rural has got back to where it was a year ago, but urban is still lower. Now, there's a caveat there. I'm comparing August 2019 to August 2020, and those are two noisy monthly surveys. And the data showed like that because the survey said everybody in taverns and restaurants was back working in rural Ontario. And I don't quite think that's the case. I don't think every fishing lodge is back and so on. So there's some variability in the data. But in most cases, rural is taking a big hit, and the really big hit is in Alberta. Rural employment is 20% below. In August of 2020, rural employment was 20% below August in 2019. Was that your question?
Great. And I stuck into the chat box the Rural Ontario's hyperlink to the Rural Ontario Institute fact sheets.
Yeah,
we've got a few questions.
Oh, Ryan, one question. If you go to the Rural Ontario Institute, they have a blog, and the blog there will point to the charts at the Canada level and point to the document that summarizes the Ontario results.
Wonderful. We have 2 or 3 more questions to go to, and I call we're running out of time. So maybe I'll pose this to Lou and to Ray. And it was posed by David Douglas with reference to public policy and immigration. How can we make the case for an attention on rural? If 10% of immigrants settle in rural settings, this would be 25 to 30 people, 1,000 per year across the country at most. And so why should the federal government get involved in trying to attract newcomers to rural areas? And how do we make the case to do that? And so I'll maybe pass it to yourselves, and you might provide a fairly concise answer so that we can continue to the next question as well before we run out of time.
Sure. There are a couple of quick points that I'll make before passing it on to Ray. The first thing that I would point out is that a lot of rural communities themselves see immigration as something that's going to be key to their futures, to growing their communities and maintaining their economies. And so I think that there is a lot of interest at the local level if the federal government was willing to reach out to those partners and develop something with them. And a second thing that I would point out is that while 10% of newcomers currently is substantial, but of course not huge, I think that there's a lot of potential to improve those numbers as rural communities have a lot of factors that make them potentially very attractive to newcomers. Things like more affordable housing, more outdoor space for raising families. The issue is that right now there are also factors that work against rural areas in terms of that lack of services and lack of cultural and religious communities that we were talking about before. So I think that if those communities and federal government could sort of work together on this issue, I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of bringing new people to our rural communities and making those communities more hospitable to newcomers in the long run. Ray, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I'll speak briefly. Thank you for the question, David. Again, this is an enormous question because of the immense complexity of Canada's immigration system when you factor in also migrant workers into that equation. I think the short answer is everybody eats. And so as Lou alluded to in his presentation, there's a disproportionate impact on Canada's food system as a whole when we neglect, in this case, temporary foreign workers and seasonal agricultural workers. That might not be a retention and settlement issue, but it's definitely an important issue. And one other classification in terms of refugees, the question, everybody's competing for public dollars right now, there's no question. I don't know how to prioritize this, but I will say that Canada's international obligation to refugees is often cast as a humanitarian effort to get individuals and families out of zones of conflict. And then it's like, well, whatever happens in Canada happens. We need to think about this in terms of humanitarianism plus, and that means offering all opportunities for individuals to succeed and live full lives once in Canada as well. And that becomes a matter for retention, integration, if you want to use that term, but leading full and rewarding lives in their place of dwelling in Canada.
Great, thanks for those comments. I'm going to see, we have one more question, and I recognize we have only about maybe 2 or 3 minutes to answer it. So I'll see if anybody would like to maybe lead off. There was a question posed by Nazar. Do people in rural communities want to grow their communities? There's been some experiences that many may not wish to have growth. Anybody who'd like to tackle that? Karen, by all means, I see your hands up, and then we can go to Victoria.
Sure. I do think it's a good question, and I think it's good to acknowledge that maybe not all communities want growth, but I think what they do want is they don't want to lose their amenities. In some cases, they want better amenities, so better health services to retain a school, for example. And they also don't all want to get old together. I think that people in communities that are shrinking or not growing recognize that having an age structure where it's all older people who maybe all need the same kinds of support or the same kind of package of support is not good, because you lose that intergenerational kind of give and take.
Well, I'm gonna, thanks, Karen. I'm gonna add that I think the real question really is, what does rural have for growth, right? So then when we had a bit of an interaction with rural community leaders at the OGRA, and what I got from it was that most of the time the concern is with the assets that are available to actually get that kind of population growth in. And that's very important to really consider. Another issue too is when someone says, I don't want here to grow, what does that mean? Because when we were having interactions, one of the comments that I had from one of the communities was that we don't have the lands to do that extra housing, right? And it's a genuine concern. We don't have the residential lands to do that. So how do we navigate this and then still get the dream rural experience that we wanted to have? And that's something to really consider. The good thing is with broadband, we also have the opportunity of having remote workers, right? So then communities that don't have the opportunity to grow in terms of space and expand, if you bring in broadband to rural areas, then they can actually still benefit from remote workers and remote businesses to grow their own economy. And that's why we are really pushing that. Look, COVID has really shown us this, that we do need rural broadband too. And it's not enough to just say, oh, rural has to grow, rural has to grow. Well, not every rural can grow the way that urban is growing. So why not use the opportunity that broadband infrastructure offers to expand on that?
Great, thanks for those responses. And we've come to the point where we've run out of time. I sincerely apologize to anyone who may have had a question that we didn't get an opportunity to answer. The links to all of the presenters are in the chat box, and I'd encourage you to follow up via email if your question wasn't asked. But at this stage, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Karen, Emily, Sara, Lou, Ray, Victoria, and Ray for your thoughtful presentations and comments this afternoon. It's been truly an informative and an exciting discussion. And I'll remind everyone that you can find the 4 Rural Insight publications on the SURF website. I'd also like to take a moment to thank everyone for taking the time out of your schedule to join for this discussion. And I'd also encourage everybody to think about ways that they can stay engaged with SURF. And I've just stuck a few of those opportunities in the chat box, whether that's signing up for the newsletter, maybe becoming a member of the foundation, of which you would get to vote in the AGM later today, or you may wish to think about even donating to SURF as a charity. So those are ways that we can stay engaged. So thank you again to all of our presenters. It's been truly exciting, and I wish everyone well as you get your break before continuing on to the next session. So thank everyone for joining us.